Mob Entertainment just released the latest in their restricted VHS series, this one centering on Catnap, of all characters, which is already very interesting. As usual, this video contains a bunch of hidden details and secrets. It also confirms some of my oldest theories going all the way back to Chapter 2, adding some new information and new evidence for those, as well as being just a little bit suspicious considering the timing of it. Now I want to discuss all of that in today's video, but usually I would do a full deep dive and analysis. I'd go frame by frame, showing every little secret and discussing it in detail, but I'm a little sick, so I don't really have the energy to do that today. But I do want to discuss the really interesting parts, the stuff that I just couldn't not talk about. So yeah, we're going to do a yap video today. It's a yap about Catnap. It's the Catnap yap. It's the cat yap. Now, first of all, I want to say I love these VHS videos. These are my favorite content that Mob produces, aside from the actual games, of course. But these are just every single time, they are so much fun to watch. These really do highlight just how dark and twisted this series is, and it really shows just how horrific Playtime Co. was, considering it's supposed to be this happy, fun toy company. Now, this one is absolutely no exception. This video shows Catnap, who is undergoing the conditioning process. Now, the conditioning process is something that some people seem to think is a new development, but we actually heard about this all the way back in Chapter 2. And we learned from a note that Marie Payne, the girl who was turned into Mommy Longlegs, she underwent this conditioning process herself because she was being violent towards the staff, but very warm towards the children. And so Playtime Co. sent her to conditioning, as I theorized all the way back then, was a form of psychological conditioning, which you could call brainwashing. I theorized that they did this to try to induce behaviors in these experiments that they wanted. After all, these experiments are made for Playtime Co.'s benefit. There may be a dual benefit, as I've discussed before. These experiments were in some cases to save the lives of children, as we saw with Theodore, but they also were to benefit the company. Everything Playtime Co. did had to benefit the company and benefit their bottom line. So in this VHS, we see that Catnap is undergoing this same process, and this is because he also killed some staff. But now we actually have a bunch more context for exactly what this conditioning process was. As I said, I theorized that this was some sort of psychological conditioning, which it is, but it also seems now that we have a concrete answer on exactly what they were doing, and what they were doing was turning these young children, these experiments, into those characters that they represent. So for example, in this VHS, we can see that they are trying to turn Theodore into Catnap. Not just by looks, they were actually trying to change his whole identity so that he believed he was Catnap. Now this kind of makes sense. These are big, dangerous experiments, and they want them to live around the orphans. They want them to be safe around staff and children. So it seems that they thought the best way to do this was to convince those children that they were actually the characters that they know and love. This ties back all the way back to some of the oldest things we know about Poppy Playtime, when we saw that poster that shows that children choosing their favorite toy as a young child was a very important process. Now, we've already theorized from this poster that this was to see who was most compatible with each toy. Maybe having a child be transformed into their favorite toy made the process more likely to be successful, but now we see that it was actually so that they could brainwash those children into believing they actually were that character. Now in this one, we can see that they are showing Catnap the VHS of the Smiling Critters. It's a bit jumbled, but we can just make it out that they are showing episodes of the Smiling Critters to Catnap. That's already super interesting because in Chapter 3, just before the chapter released, we were shown an episode of the Smiling Critters that seemed really odd. It seemed like it was a full episode of the show, but it ended with some really weird scenes. But the main part of that show was it was showing Catnap putting the other experiments to sleep. Now we know that one of the main roles for Catnap in the factory was to use the gas to put the orphans to sleep. So it now makes sense that this Smiling Critters episode was made specifically for Theodore. It was made for him, for them to show him what his job was. Again, they were brainwashing him into it. And so this VHS, or this Smiling Critters episode, being so weird now makes perfect sense. But of course, we know that that episode managed to leak out of the factory, And that was one of the reasons why Playtime Co. started to have a downfall. Between that and also some of the Catnap dolls being sent out with their gas in them instead of the scent that they were supposed to have, this was like a double whammy that made people suddenly very suspicious of Playtime Co. and stop buying their product, which just spiraled into the downfall of the factory, which inevitably led into the Hour of Joy. So that makes complete sense to me, but what I find really weird is the timing of this. Now we see this VHS focuses on Catnap, and we've had one for Huggy, one for Kissy, and one for Bron, each one showing a bit more of the backstory of those experiments, and like I said, each one being incredibly dark and weird. But this one being of Catnap right before Chapter 5 comes out might just be a little hint that we are indeed going to see Catnap in Chapter 5. Now, before you start attacking me saying, Tericho, no, we saw that the Catnap, he got killed, he got his whole hand, the prototype, put his hand through his brain. Listen, okay, just hear me out, right? Chapter 5 is called Broken Things, and as we've seen, the last thing we saw of Catnap was he was himself very broken. We set him on fire, and then the prototype speared him through the face. But something else that we already know about this series is that death isn't necessarily the end. I've made dozens of videos talking about how Huggy was going to come back, and many people told me I was wrong, and lo and behold, Huggy came back after we presumed he himself was dead. We saw that Harley Sawyer was kept alive even though he was just a couple of organs and a brain, so, you know, there's that. But we know that in Playtime Co., death isn't always the end, and this was part of the scientific process, was keeping people alive even when they otherwise would die. So, knowing all of that and knowing that the prototype does absolutely seem to care about the experiments that follow him, he seems to care about the orphans too, but he seems to really care about the experiments that follow him, as particularly Catnap. It seems like they have a bit of a special bond ever since the prototype saved Theodore's life. Obviously, Theodore sort of worships the prototype, but it also seems like the prototype really does care for Theodore too. It seems like a bit of a, you know, maybe father-son type of relationship going on there. And so the idea that he would just kill Catnap just so nonchalantly, it doesn't sit right with me. Now, we were under the impression that Catnap was going to be put on the shrine type amalgamation experiment that Mommy Longlegs was also going to be put on. But remember, that was never confirmed. That was only a theory. Now, in Chapter 3, it does seem like the prototype confirmed that he was building some sort of amalgamation. But at the same time, we also know from the Chapter 5 marketing that we are all somehow wrong about what the prototype wants. It says, you think you know what he wants, you know nothing, not yet. So, there is a good chance that theory might be incorrect, and that the prototype isn't trying to take these toys to put them into a big amalgamation kaiju creature. Perhaps he's actually trying to save them. Again, Mommy, Huggy, and Catnap are all loyal to the prototype, and he seems to really try to take care of those that are loyal to him. So there is a chance that the prototype has fixed Catnap and that we're going to see a withered or a broken, I think broken probably, broken versions. But there's a good chance that we are going to see a broken version of Catnap in Chapter 5. Now, of course, it's still possible that Catnap is dead. He is being held in stasis or something like that, and maybe he won't be an actual antagonist of Chapter 5. But considering how the community reacted when Huggy was brought back, I think it would be amazing if we were actually going to see Catnap somehow still alive in Chapter 5. I think that would be great. And again, this is a science fiction game where people are kept alive way after they should have been, so there's nothing to say that that couldn't happen. Now, another really interesting part about this VHS is that we see somebody called Preston. We see these two scientists, and there's a man and a woman, and they both are discussing the experiments that are being taken place. They're discussing the conditioning, and we hear that one of them is called Preston. Now, I'm sure many of you have already theorized that Preston, it could be PW. If you don't know PW was the owner of the orientation notebook. That notebook was actually PW's copy, and there were a bunch of little hints in there that PW wasn't really a big fan of what was going on in the factory. We know that PW was part of the surgeries, or at least saw the surgeries, and it was something that really didn't sit right with them. And now we also see that this Preston character is also questioning this process. They are kind of protesting. They're saying they're not really a big fan of this. So it's pretty likely that Preston is PW. Now, I have already made a bunch of theories about PW in the past. I've said that there's a chance that PW could stand for somebody white. Preston White, maybe. Could be Dr. White's son. Who knows? That's just a theory. But I do think that this is a very, very solid chance that this character, Preston, is actually PW. And there is also a chance that PW is the playable character. That would explain why the playable character has so much guilt for what happened in this factory, and now this is just another scene of our playable character's guilt. We also, just to add on to that, we do see in a bunch of the flashes, we see a bunch of references to PW, so I think it's pretty safe to say that Preston is PW. Now, these little flashes, I think we're going to get some new information on PW in the Chapter 5, because we see a bunch of little screens and messages, and they all seem to be talking to PW. But we also know from Project Playtime that there was somebody in the factory that was working against Playtime Co., probably the same people that leaked the Catnap VHS tape and things like that. So it's all kind of coming together now. All of those years of theorizing seem to be coming together, and I think we are going to get a big reveal of PW in Chapter 5. Now, we also get the mention of a Grace, and as far as I can remember, I don't think we know a Grace character in Poppy Playtime. I don't think there's been a Grace. I could be wrong. Let me know in the comments if I'm wrong. But as far as I remember, Grace is a brand new character. They talk about this psychological conditioning is Grace's. Now, again, timing might be a little bit suspicious, but I wonder if Grace might be tied to Lily Lovebraids. We do know that some of the experiments, at least, were adults. They weren't all orphans. So there's a chance that Lily Lovebraids could be Grace and maybe has been continuing the psychological conditioning alongside the prototype. Not sure, just a little mini theory. But yeah, I want to know who Grace is. So, because we know pretty much all the names of the higher-ups, so Grace could be somebody new. I don't know, but something interesting to talk about. Now, just to go back to the idea of identity, I think this is going to be a key theme of this series. I think it already is a key theme, but I think this is something that's going to be expanded upon in Chapter 5. And that is the idea that these children, these experiments, they weren't only being experimented on. It wasn't just that their bodies were being changed, it's that also their personalities, their identities were also being changed. Playtime Co. were trying to transform these children into these mascot characters, and they were trying to completely change their identity to match that. And I think that is probably a big part of why it inevitably ended up failing. This is probably a big part of why so many of these toys joined in with the Hour of Joy, because they were not only being imprisoned, they were not only being forced to undergo these experiments because Playtime Co. decided that they were going to be, but they were also having their entire identities stolen from them. And I think that is such an interesting, new, fresh take on this kind of genre. Now, I've already talked about this before, but this, I think, is the biggest confirmation we've ever had that this game series is not based on Five Nights at Freddy's like a lot of people believe, but it is more based on series like Bioshock and Portal. I've made a whole video on this, maybe go check that one out, but I've said it before, there are so many similarities between Bioshock and Portal and Poppy Playtime, and one of the big key themes of Bioshock was the idea of people being controlled psychologically. I'm not going to spoil it in case you've never played Bioshock. Go play it, it's a great game series. But in Bioshock, there are characters who are lied to and manipulated, but there are also characters who were created to behave in a certain way, and that those characters are basically under complete control of powerful scientists. I think this is a very relevant theme to Poppy Playtime. The idea that the science in this game series, which again, science is a massive theme of both Bioshock and Portal, but the science that is being undertaken to benefit those scientists, benefit certain people, and the people who are the experiments, well, they're just, part of the science. They don't really matter. I think that this idea of psychological conditioning really just highlights how Poppy Playtime has definitely been inspired a lot by games like Bioshock, and I think that's a great thing. I think Portal was one of the very first games ever to do an ARG, and Bioshock was definitely one of the first games I remember that had such a big, memorable twist where everything that I knew about the game was just completely thrown out the window by a big twist. And we've seen this a lot with Poppy Playtime. So I think this video showing the conditioning is just one further reinforcement that I was right about that Poppy Playtime is inspired by Bioshock and Portal. And so if you're looking for clues about what this series could be, look at those. Don't look at FNAF. Don't look at Bendy. Look at the This game's about science. This is a scientific game more than it is a mascot horror game. Yeah, of course, it's mascot horror, but it's rooted more in games like Bioshock and Portal than it is, say, FNAF. Like I said, I just found this really interesting. I think the themes of this video are more interesting than the details in a lot of ways. And I do think that the timing of this video is very, very sneaky on Mob's part. And yeah, I'm really interested now to see if we are going to see Catnap alive. I'd say alive and well, but I don't think he's going to be well. But I'm going to see if he's going to be alive in Chapter 5. And I do wonder how much of that psychological conditioning is still in effect. Does Theodore still know he's Theodore? Or is he now torn between Catnap and Theodore? And has the prototype been using that to his advantage? Who knows? Maybe the prototype has been using that psychological conditioning too. There's a lot of questions. A lot of questions still to answer, and I can't wait to find out more in Chapter 5. But let me know what you thought down in the comments below. Do you think I'm right? Think I'm wrong? I don't know. Let me know. I'm going to go and edit this video. No fancy editing today because I need to go to bed. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.